Where did the Spartans go? Sparta is one of the most famous names in history. We remember the warriors, the red cloaks, the shields locked together at Thermopylae. But there is a question almost never asked. If Sparta was so powerful, so feared, so disciplined, where did it go? There is no moment when Sparta burns. No dramatic final battle where the last Spartan falls. No conqueror standing over its ruins. The city simply fades. By the time Rome rules the Mediterranean, Sparta is already a shadow. By the time Christianity spreads through Greece, the Spartan way of life is gone. And by the early Middle Ages, the name survives, but the people behind it seem to have vanished. Most civilizations fall because they are defeated. Sparta was different. It was not destroyed by foreign armies. It was not conquered by a greater empire. It did not collapse overnight. Instead, it slowly became irrelevant. The system that once made Sparta unstoppable, its discipline, its rigidity, its refusal to change, became the very thing that doomed it. This is not a story about a single battle. It is a story about time. About what happens when a society is built perfectly for one world and that world disappears. And at the very end of this story, the Spartans do not die fighting. They leave. They abandon the open valleys where their ancestors trained for war and move toward a place of stone, sea, and survival. A place far from the battlefields that made them famous. By the end of this video, we will find them there, not as warriors, but as the last survivors of a legend. To understand how Sparta disappeared, we must first understand why it once dominated Greece. Sparta was not simply a city-state. It was an experiment. While other Greek cities grew organically, shaped by trade, culture, and debate, Sparta was deliberately engineered. Every aspect of life was designed to serve one war. From the moment a Spartan child was born, the state intervened. Newborns were inspected by elders. Those deemed weak were abandoned, not out of cruelty, but because weakness was seen as a threat to collective survival. In Sparta, the individual mattered less than the system. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were removed from their families and entered the agoge, the state-run training system that defined Spartan life. This was not education in the modern sense. There were no lessons in reading philosophy or studying history. There were no discussions about politics or ethics. The agoge taught endurance. Boys were trained to withstand hunger, pain, cold, and exhaustion. They slept on reeds. They went barefoot year-round. They were beaten to enforce discipline. Food was deliberately scarce. Spartan boys were encouraged to steal to survive. If they were caught, they were punished not for stealing, but for being careless. From an early age, Spartans learned that intelligence meant survival, and obedience meant belonging. Friendship, loyalty, and identity were forged not in families, but in shared hardship. By adulthood, Spartan men did not see themselves as individuals with personal ambitions. They saw themselves as part of a living formation, interchangeable, replaceable, and bound to the collective. This system produced soldiers who were calm under pressure, disciplined in formation, and unafraid of death. It also stripped them of flexibility. At the top of Spartan society stood the homoi, the equals. These were the full Spartan citizens, men who had completed the agoge and earned the right to fight in the phalanx. Equality in Sparta did not mean freedom. It meant conformity. All equals were expected to live the same way, eat the same food, and fight the same battles. Individual success was discouraged. Standing out was dangerous. To maintain their status, Spartan men had to contribute regularly to communal meals known as the syssitia. These meals were not social gatherings. They were political institutions. Failure to contribute meant loss of status, and once lost, Spartan citizenship could almost never be regained. There was no easy path into the ranks of the equals. Sparta did not expand its citizen body. It did not reward talent from below. The result was a shrinking elite. As wars claimed lives and families failed to produce heirs, the number of full Spartan citizens steadily declined. Sparta responded not by reforming, but by tightening standards even further. What had once been a strength exclusivity slowly became a demographic trap. Sparta was powerful because its citizens were few, disciplined, and unified, but it was fragile for the very same reason. Beneath the equals lived the majority of Sparta's population, the Helots. They were not foreigners. They were conquered Greeks, primarily from Messenia, forced into permanent servitude. Helots worked the land. They produced food. They sustained the Spartan economy. Without Helots, Spartan citizens could not train full-time as soldiers. This dependence created fear. Helots outnumbered Spartans by a vast margin. In some periods, they may have been 10 times more numerous. Sparta lived in constant anxiety of rebellion. To control this population, the Spartans developed institutionalized terror. Each year, Spartan officials formally declared war on the Helots. This legal fiction allowed Helots to be killed without religious consequences. Young Spartans were sent on secret missions, the Crypteia, where they hunted and murdered Helots, considered strong, intelligent, or dangerous. These acts were not random brutality. They were policy. Sparta was permanently mobilized against its own workforce. This arrangement allowed the Spartan elite to exist as professional warriors, but it locked Sparta into an economic system that could not evolve. Helots could not innovate. Spartans would not work. Trade stagnated. Wealth accumulation was discouraged. The entire society balanced on repression. Once that repression weakened, everything else would follow. Spartan women occupied a unique place in Greek society. Unlike women in Athens or Corinth, Spartan women were educated, physically trained, and legally empowered. They owned land. They managed estates. They spoke publicly, sometimes sharply. This was not ideological progress. It was necessity. While Spartan men lived in barracks and trained for war well into adulthood, women became the managers of Spartan society. They supervised Helo labor. They preserved family wealth. They ensured the continuation of Spartan bloodlines. Spartan women were expected to be strong because weakness threatened the system. They did not raise sons to seek happiness. They raised sons to endure suffering and face death without hesitation. This expectation became cultural identity. Yet even this strength existed within a closed world. Sparta discouraged travel. Foreign visitors were viewed with suspicion. Luxury goods were banned. Coinage was crude and intentionally inconvenient. Sparta rejected change as corruption. It never built walls around its city, believing that Spartan men were its walls. It invested little in art, philosophy, or science. While other Greek cities evolved, adapted, and expanded their influence, Sparta remained fixed. Sparta never built cities. It built warriors, and that worked only as long as the world remained a battlefield. By the early 5th century BCE, Sparta stood at the height of its influence. It was not the largest Greek city, nor the wealthiest, nor the most culturally vibrant, but it was the most respected military power in the Greek world. Sparta dominated the Peloponnese through a loose but effective network of alliances known as the Peloponnesian League. Its authority did not come from conquest or occupation, but from reputation. Other city-states followed Sparta because they trusted its discipline and feared its army. Sparta's leaders believed stability mattered more than expansion. They avoided long campaigns far from home. They discouraged ambition that might weaken internal order. This was a deeply conservative power. Sparta did not seek to reshape Greece. It sought to preserve a balance that favored its own survival. And this mindset shaped how Sparta reacted when a new and overwhelming threat appeared from the east, the Persian Empire. Persia was unlike anything the Greeks had ever faced. It was vast, wealthy, and centralized, stretching from Anatolia deep into Asia. Entire kingdoms had fallen before it. When Persia turned its attention toward Greece, the Greek world fractured almost immediately. Some cities submitted, others resisted. Many hesitated, unsure whether resistance was even possible. Sparta hesitated too, not because it doubted Persian power, but because war itself posed a danger to Sparta's internal system. Extended campaigns meant fewer soldiers at home. Fewer soldiers meant greater risk of Helot unrest. Sparta did not fear Persia alone. It feared disruption. In 480 BCE, the Persian king Xerxes launched a massive invasion of Greece. Greek resistance formed around narrow passes and defensive positions where discipline could offset numbers. One of those positions was Thermopylae. The Spartan king Leonidas led a small Greek force north to delay the Persian advance. Among them were 300 Spartan warriors, not the full Spartan army, but a symbolic core. What followed became one of the most famous episodes in military history. For days, the Greek defenders held the narrow pass, inflicting heavy losses on the Persians. Spartan discipline and training proved devastating in close combat, but Thermopylae was never meant to be a decisive victory. When a traitor revealed a path around the pass, Leonidas understood that the position was lost. Retreat was possible for most of the Greek force. Leonidas chose to stay. The Spartans and their allies fought to the death, delaying the Persian advance and buying time for Greece to prepare. Strategically, Thermopylae was a defeat, but symbolically, it was transformative. The sacrifice of Leonidas and his men became the embodiment of Spartan ideals: obedience to law, endurance, and loyalty unto death. Sparta's image was sealed. Yet this image was also a trap. Thermopylae immortalized what Sparta had been, not what it would need to become. While poets and historians celebrated Spartan sacrifice, the nature of warfare was already changing, and Sparta would struggle to change with it. The Persian Wars ended in Greek victory. On land, Spartan hoplites played a crucial role. At sea, the Athenian navy shattered Persian power. Together, the Greek city-states preserved their independence, but what followed mattered far more than the war itself. Athens transformed victory into opportunity. It expanded its navy, built an empire of allies and tribute, invested in trade, art, architecture, and political experimentation. Sparta did not. Sparta returned home. Its leaders believed the Persian wars had proven their system was superior. Discipline had triumphed over wealth. Tradition had defeated empire, and so Sparta chose not to change. It rejected imperial ambition. It distrusted foreign wealth. It resisted political reform. This was not negligence. It was ideology. Sparta believed stability was strength, and change was decay. But the Greek world was evolving rapidly. Power was shifting toward naval dominance. Economic networks were expanding. Political influence increasingly depended on flexibility and innovation. Sparta remained what it had always been, a city designed for hoplite warfare and regional dominance. The Persian Wars preserved Sparta's position, but they also removed the pressure to adapt. Victory became confirmation, and confirmation became stagnation. Sparta had survived the greatest external threat it would ever face. But in doing so, it locked itself into a world that was already disappearing. The wars that followed would expose this weakness, and Sparta would discover that discipline alone was no longer enough. After the Persian Wars, Greece did not find peace. It found rivalry. Two very different powers now stood at the center of the Greek world. Athens, wealthy, naval, outward-looking, and increasingly confident. And Sparta, disciplined, land-based, conservative, and deeply suspicious of change. At first, their roles seemed complementary. Athens ruled the seas. Sparta dominated the land, but balance did not last. Athens used its navy to build an empire. Allies became subjects. Tribute flowed into the city. Walls rose. Ships multiplied. Power concentrated. To Sparta, this was dangerous. Not just because Athens was growing stronger, but because it represented everything Sparta rejected: wealth, innovation, political experimentation. Spartan leaders feared that Athenian influence would destabilize the Peloponnese, encouraging rebellion among allies and, worse, among Helots. Fear, more than ambition, drove Sparta toward war. In 431 BCE, conflict erupted. What followed would last nearly 3 decades. The Peloponnesian War. It would consume a generation, reshape Greece, and expose the limits of Spartan power. From the beginning, the war revealed a fundamental imbalance. Athens avoided direct land battles. Its people withdrew behind massive walls. Its navy controlled the sea. Sparta, supreme on land, could ravage the countryside, but it could not force Athens to surrender. Year after year, Spartan armies marched into Attica, burned fields, and destroyed villages. And year after year, Athens endured. Sparta's strength, short, decisive land campaigns, was useless against a fortified naval power. Worse still, prolonged war strained Sparta's internal system. Citizen soldiers were tied down for long periods. Helots were left with fewer overseers. The risk of rebellion increased. Sparta found itself fighting a kind of war it had never prepared for, a war of endurance. Athens suffered terribly as well. Plague ravaged the city. Political chaos followed. But Athens adapted. Sparta resisted adaptation. Only when Persian gold entered the conflict did the balance shift. Sparta accepted financial support from its former enemy to build a fleet, a profound contradiction of Spartan values. Victory now depended on what Sparta had once rejected: money. In 404 BCE, Athens finally surrendered. Its walls were torn down, its navy dismantled, its empire collapsed. Sparta had won. For the first time in its history, Sparta stood as the dominant power in Greece. But this victory came at a cost Sparta barely understood. Persian gold had corrupted the old discipline. Spartan commanders now operated abroad, exposed to luxury and power. Equality among the homoioi weakened. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. The old Spartan system began to crack. Sparta attempted to rule Greece, something it had never intended to do. Garrisons were imposed. Governments were overthrown. Resentment spread rapidly. Former allies now feared Spartan domination. Sparta had defeated Athens and inherited its enemies. More dangerously, Sparta had abandoned its own principles without replacing them with anything sustainable. The system that once worked in isolation could not function as an empire. Sparta's dominance was brief. Within a single generation, resistance formed across Greece. Former allies revolted. New coalitions emerged. Persia shifted its support once again. Sparta found itself overstretched, undermanned, and increasingly divided. The number of full Spartan citizens continued to decline. The army that once relied on disciplined equals now depended on mercenaries and allies. Sparta had won the greatest war of its history, and in doing so, it had exposed its deepest weakness. Victory required adaptation, and adaptation undermined everything Sparta was built upon. The Peloponnesian War did not destroy Sparta immediately, but it transformed it into something fragile. The city that once defined stability now faced a future it could no longer control, and the moment that would shatter the Spartan myth entirely was approaching. A single battlefield, a single defeat, one that would prove Sparta was no longer invincible. By the early 4th century BCE, Sparta was no longer what it had been. It still carried authority. Its name still commanded respect. But beneath the surface, the foundations were eroding. The number of full Spartan citizens had fallen dramatically. The old equality of the homoioi was fading. Wealth and power were concentrating in fewer hands. Sparta still fielded armies, but they were thinner, more fragile, and increasingly dependent on allies. At the same time, a new power was rising in Greece. Thebes. For generations, Thebes had lived in the shadow of larger powers. Now, under innovative leadership, it began to challenge the old order. The Thebans did something Sparta had not done in a very long time. They adapted, they experimented with tactics, they questioned tradition, they trained differently. Sparta noticed, but did not fully understand the danger. When conflict finally came, Spartan leaders believed the outcome was already decided. No Spartan army had ever been decisively defeated in open battle. That belief would not survive the day. In 371 BCE, Spartan and Theban forces met near the village of Leuctra in Boeotia. On paper, the Spartans should have won. They were experienced. They were disciplined. They were Spartans. But the battlefield revealed something new. The Theban commander Epaminondas deployed his forces in an unconventional way. Instead of spreading his troops evenly, he concentrated strength on one wing. He struck where the Spartans were strongest. This was deliberate. The Spartan right flank, traditionally led by elite troops, was expected to break the enemy as it always had. Instead, it collapsed. For the first time in living memory, a Spartan phalanx broke and fled. The Spartan king Cleombrotus was killed. Hundreds of full Spartan citizens died on the field. This loss was catastrophic. Sparta could not replace these men. They were not just soldiers. They were the system. Leuctra was not a long battle, but its impact was irreversible. The myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered in a single afternoon, and everyone in Greece saw it happen. The consequences of Leuctra rippled outward immediately. Cities that had feared Sparta for generations began to reconsider their loyalty. Allies defected. Enemies grew bolder. Most devastating of all, Sparta lost control of Messenia. The Helots were freed. This was an economic catastrophe. For centuries, Spartan power had rested on Helo labor. Without it, the entire system unraveled. There was no surplus to support full-time warriors, no stability to preserve the old order. Sparta was not destroyed. Its walls were not burned. Its people were not slaughtered. Instead, Sparta was exposed. It still existed, but no longer mattered. Leuctra marked the end of Sparta as a dominant power, not because it lost a battle, but because it lost its illusion. The belief that discipline alone could overcome change. The belief that tradition was stronger than adaptation. From this point on, Sparta would never recover its former position. What followed was not sudden collapse. It was something quieter, a long retreat from relevance. After Leuctra, Sparta was still standing. Its buildings remained. Its laws were still spoken. Its name still carried centuries of memory. But power had left the city. For generations, Sparta had ruled Greece through fear and reputation. That reputation was now broken. Cities that once obeyed without question began to act independently. Former allies withdrew their support. Enemies no longer hesitated. Sparta tried to respond as it always had, by mobilizing armies, by issuing commands, by relying on discipline. But the conditions that had made discipline effective were gone. The loss of Messenia was decisive. When Thebes freed the Helots, Sparta lost the foundation of its economy. The fields that had fed Spartan warriors for centuries were no longer under Spartan control. Without Helot labor, Spartan citizens could no longer dedicate their lives entirely to military training. They had to work, manage, and survive like ordinary people. This was not how the system was designed to function. Sparta could survive battles. It could not survive structural change. In theory, Sparta could have adapted. Other Greek cities had done so after defeat. They reformed laws, expanded citizenship, restructured economies. Sparta did none of this. The problem was not lack of intelligence or courage. It was ideology. Spartan identity was built on the belief that their way of life was perfect. That deviation was decay. That reform was weakness. To change the system would mean admitting it had failed. So Sparta clung to tradition. But tradition could not solve new problems. The number of full Spartan citizens continued to shrink. Land concentrated in fewer families. Economic inequality increased. The old equality of the homoi, already weakened, effectively collapsed. Sparta increasingly relied on non-Spartan troops, mercenaries, and allies. The army still marched, but it was no longer a Spartan army in the old sense. What remained was form without substance, ritual without power. Despite everything, Sparta did not disappear. It was not conquered. It was not destroyed. No enemy marched in to erase it from history. Instead, Sparta became marginal. It participated in Greek politics, but no longer dominated them. It fought in wars, but no longer decided their outcome. New powers rose. Macedon emerged under Philip and Alexander. The Greek world shifted once again. Sparta watched. It resisted Macedonian control stubbornly, proudly, but resistance only emphasized how isolated it had become. The world had moved on. Sparta remained locked in an older age. By the time Rome arrived in Greece, Sparta was already a relic. Romans admired it. They studied it. They visited it. But they did not fear it. Sparta had survived but as a memory. The city still existed. The people still lived there. Yet the society that once defined warfare, discipline, and dominance was gone. Not destroyed in a single moment, but slowly left behind by history. By the 3rd century BCE, it was clear that Sparta was in trouble. The decline was no longer subtle. The number of full Spartan citizens had fallen to a fraction of what it once was. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few powerful families. The old balance of equality had collapsed. Sparta's armies still marched, but they no longer resembled the force that had once dominated Greece. Even within Sparta, people understood that something was wrong. The question was not whether reform was needed. It was how much change Sparta could tolerate without ceasing to be Sparta at all. For centuries, Spartan law had been treated as sacred. Tradition was not just respected, it was untouchable. To challenge it was to challenge Spartan identity itself. Yet without reform, the city faced slow extinction. This tension defined Sparta's final attempts at revival. The first serious attempt came under King Aegeus IV in the mid-3rd century BCE. Aegeus recognized the core problem immediately. Too few citizens, too much land in too few hands, a society no longer capable of supporting itself. His solution was radical but logical. Cancel debts, redistribute land, restore equality among Spartan citizens. In other Greek cities, such reforms might have sparked debate. In Sparta, they sparked fear. The wealthy elite resisted fiercely. They had benefited from decades of decline. Reform threatened their power. Aegeus lacked the force to impose change. He believed persuasion and tradition would be enough. They were not. Aegeus was arrested, tried, and executed. Sparta had chosen stability over survival. A generation later, King Cleomenes III tried again. He learned from Aegeus's failure. Cleomenes acted decisively. He executed his opponents, redistributed land, expanded citizenship to include non-Spartans willing to adopt Spartan discipline. For a brief moment, it worked. Sparta's population stabilized. The army regained strength. The old system seemed reborn. But the price was high. Cleomenes had broken the very traditions he claimed to restore. His reforms depended on personal authority, not consensus. When external pressure came, especially from Macedon, Sparta stood alone. Cleomenes was defeated. His reforms collapsed, and with them, Sparta's last real chance at recovery. After this, there were no more serious attempts at reform. Sparta did not collapse dramatically. It simply ran out of options. The city that once refused to change now discovered it was too late to do so. By the time Rome became the dominant power in Greece, Sparta no longer frightened anyone. It was not conquered in a dramatic campaign. It was absorbed quietly, almost gently. To the Romans, Sparta was not a rival. It was a legend. Roman elites admired the old stories of Spartan discipline and sacrifice. They read about Thermopylae. They praised the agoge. They spoke of Spartan virtue as something lost in their own age. Sparta became useful again, not as a military power, but as an idea. Roman writers presented it as a model of moral severity, a society that valued duty over comfort, order over indulgence. But admiration did not mean revival. The Rome that ruled Greece had no need for Spartan soldiers. It had legions. What it wanted from Sparta was something else: authenticity. Under Roman rule, Sparta was allowed a surprising degree of autonomy. Its ancient institutions were preserved. Its rituals were encouraged. Its reputation was carefully maintained. But this preservation was theatrical. Spartan youths still underwent harsh training, now observed by Roman visitors. Public endurance contests were staged. Ancient customs were reenacted. What had once been preparation for war became performance. Sparta turned inward, not out of strength, but because there was nowhere else to go. Roman tourists came to see the city of warriors. They wanted to witness pain, discipline, and severity safely from a distance. Sparta obliged. The city that once rejected foreign influence now depended on it. Its identity survived but hollowed out. The Spartan way of life continued, not because it was necessary, but because it was expected. By this point, Sparta no longer controlled its destiny. It existed within a larger imperial system. Its economy was modest. Its population unremarkable. What remained was symbolism. Sparta was no longer feared. It was admired. And admiration is a poor substitute for power. The Roman world preserved Sparta as a moral exhibit, a reminder of an earlier age. But the values that once made Sparta dominant could not function in this new reality. Discipline without purpose became ritual. Tradition without power became nostalgia. Sparta had become a museum of itself. The myth survived. The society did not. And yet, the people were still there, living among ruins, maintaining customs that no longer shaped the world. Soon, even this quiet existence would face new pressures: instability, invasions, a changing Mediterranean world. And once again, the descendants of Sparta would be forced to move. When Rome expanded into Greece, Sparta was no longer a power to be challenged. There were no great battles, no heroic resistance, no dramatic conquest. Sparta simply passed into Roman control quietly, almost unnoticed. To the Romans, Sparta was not an enemy. It was a legend. Roman writers, philosophers, and politicians spoke about Sparta with admiration. They praised its discipline, its austerity, its devotion to duty. In a Roman world increasingly wealthy and complex, Sparta represented something pure, a moral ideal from a harsher age. Thermopylae fascinated them. The agoge intrigued them. The idea of men trained to endure pain without complaint became a symbol of lost virtue. But admiration is not power. Rome had legions. It had administration, infrastructure, and empire. What it wanted from Sparta was not soldiers. It wanted a story. Under Roman rule, Sparta was allowed to preserve its ancient customs. Its institutions were not dismantled. Its traditions were not erased. They were curated. Spartan youths still underwent harsh training. Endurance rituals were maintained. Public displays of discipline continued. But the purpose had changed. These practices were no longer preparation for war. They were performances. Roman visitors came to see Sparta as one might visit a monument. They wanted to witness severity, pain, and endurance safely from the outside. What had once been necessity became spectacle. Sparta adjusted. It leaned into its reputation. It preserved the image Romans expected to see. The city that once rejected foreign influence now relied on it. Its economy benefited from attention. Its identity depended on memory. Sparta became a living exhibit, a society reenacting its own past. By this stage, Sparta no longer shaped events. It existed within a vast imperial system. Its political influence was minimal. Its military role insignificant. What remained was symbolism. Sparta had become a reference point, a moral example rather than a political actor. Discipline without danger became ritual. Tradition without power became nostalgia. The Roman world preserved Sparta carefully. But preservation is not survival. The Spartan way of life no longer evolved. It no longer responded to threats or opportunities. It was frozen, and frozen societies do not endure forever. The myth of Sparta lived on stronger, perhaps, than ever. But the society that created that myth had already faded. Soon, even this carefully preserved existence would face new pressures. Instability would return. Security would matter more than symbolism. And once again, the descendants of Sparta would be forced to move, not to preserve an image, but simply to survive. By late antiquity, the world around Sparta had changed completely. The Roman order was weakening. Imperial authority fractured. Trade routes became unreliable. Greece entered a period of instability. Raids, migrations, and invasions spread across the Balkans and the Aegean. Slavic groups moved south into the Peloponnese. Old inland cities became vulnerable. For centuries, Sparta had relied on reputation and tradition for security. Now, neither offered protection. The city lay exposed in an open valley, far from the sea, without walls, without an army capable of defending it. What remained of Sparta's population faced a simple reality. They could not stay. This was not a single moment of evacuation. There was no official decree. Instead, it was a gradual movement. Families left first. Administrators followed. Communities slowly shifted towards safer ground. The descendants of Sparta were no longer warriors defending a homeland. They were civilians seeking survival. Along the southeastern coast of the Peloponnese rose a massive rock, steep, isolated, almost impossible to assault. Its name was Monemvasia. The word means single entrance. A narrow causeway connected it to the mainland, easily defended and easily controlled. For a population used to open plains and battle formations, this was a radical change. But the logic was undeniable. Monemvasia offered natural fortification, sea access for trade and supply, protection from raids that devastated inland settlements. This was not a continuation of Sparta's old power. It was an admission that the old world was gone. The people who settled in Monemvasia were not Spartan warriors marching together. They were descendants of Laconians' families, officials, craftsmen, survivors. They brought with them memory, not institutions. No agoge, no phalanx, no homoioi. What survived was identity diluted, adapted, transformed. From an inland warrior society, they became coastal citizens of a Byzantine world. The move to Monemvasia marked the final transformation of Sparta. For centuries, Spartan identity had been built around open land, wide valleys, battlefields where formations met face to face. Monemvasia represented the complete opposite, a fortified rock rising directly from the sea, protected not by armies, but by walls and isolation, defended by geography rather than discipline. Today, Monemvasia is a living town, a place people visit for its stone streets, medieval walls, and dramatic setting above the water. A tourist destination on the southeastern edge of the Peloponnese. It lies roughly 90 kilometers from ancient Sparta, from the Laconian Valley where Spartan power was born. Close enough to belong to the same land. Far enough to represent a different world. The people who settled here were no longer Spartans in the classical sense. They did not live by the agoge. They did not fight in phalanxes. They did not define themselves by conquest. They were descendants of Laconians adapting to survival in a changing Mediterranean world. From inland warriors, they became coastal citizens. From soldiers of the land, they became inhabitants of the sea. This was not the continuation of Sparta's power. It was its quiet conclusion. Sparta did not fall in flames. It did not end in a final battle. It ended here, behind stone walls, above the sea. For a time, Roman rule preserved Sparta. Its name survived. Its customs were remembered. Its image was carefully maintained. But preservation only works when the world around you is stable. As Roman authority weakened, old protections faded. Trade routes fractured. Security disappeared. Greece entered a new age of uncertainty. In that world, reputation meant nothing. Tradition offered no defense. And for the descendants of Sparta, survival once again demanded movement. Sparta is remembered as a city of warriors, a place of discipline, sacrifice, and strength, a society that trained its people not to live well but to endure. For centuries, that system worked. It produced soldiers who could stand their ground when others broke. It created a reputation so powerful that it shaped history long after the city itself declined. But Sparta was built for a single purpose. And when the world changed, that purpose became a limitation. Sparta did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was rigid. It could not expand its citizenship. It could not reform its economy. It could not adapt its identity. Victory confirmed its beliefs. Tradition replaced flexibility. And discipline, once its greatest strength, became a cage. When Sparta lost its power, it did not vanish overnight. It lingered. It survived as memory, as ritual, as myth. And finally, when even memory could no longer protect it, its people moved. Not in formation, not in defiance, but quietly, from the open valleys of Laconia to stone walls above the sea. The Spartans did not disappear because they were defeated. They disappeared because the world no longer needed what they were built to be. And that may be the final lesson of Sparta. A society can be perfectly designed and still fail, because survival does not belong to the strongest or the most disciplined or the most feared. It belongs to those who can change,